What is worse, inflation or deflation? Well, by now everyone knows what inflation is, as we've had some of the worst inflation in modern history for the last 3 to 5 years. In 2022, inflation hit around 8.5% as the Fed started their fastest rate hiking cycle in history, when they went from essentially 0% interest rates all the way up to 5.5%. And where we stand right now, inflation has been on a pretty steady decline since it peaked in 2022. Now, I want everyone to be aware that just because inflation hit 8.5% and now it's around 2.3% at the time I'm making this video, it does not mean prices have gone down. Inflation just means the rate of change at which prices are increasing. So when inflation was 8.5%, what that means is that it was 8.5% more expensive than the year before. Inflation is measured at the year-over-year change of goods. So let's say a year after the peak of 8.5%, inflation was sitting at around 4.5%, which it was roughly. That does not mean the cost of goods was cheaper than when inflation was 8.5%. What it means is that year over year, from that period where inflation was 8.5%, goods and services are now on average 4.5% more expensive than they were in 2022. And then a year later, inflation was around 3%. So things are still getting more and more expensive. As inflation declines, it doesn't mean at all that the cost of living is declining. It just means it's getting more expensive slower. So right now, inflation's around 2.3%. That means it's 2.3% more expensive than it was to live a year ago on average. Obviously, housing is a huge part of that, and as house prices have increased, that has also affected the inflation rate. So what is deflation? Well, deflation is in fact prices declining, and we don't really experience deflation often. What we're experiencing right now is something called disinflation, which just means a slower rate of change for inflation. So let's dive into the data right now, and we can take a look at what inflation has done for the last 20 years. And this is where inflation peaked at around, apologies, it actually went to 9.1%, not 8.5%. So inflation peaked in June of 2022 and then dropped all the way down to 3% in June of 2023, and then bounced around, went to 4% and down a little bit, and now inflation is sitting at 2.3%. So this is disinflation, where inflation is still positive. The rate at which prices on everyday items are increasing is still a positive number. But what is deflation? Well, as you can see, during the pandemic in 2020, we almost experienced deflation, where the rate of change was around 0.1%. And then we had a brief deflationary period right here where it went down to 0.2%. But the financial crisis is when the real deflation happened, where in August of 2008, we went to 5.4%, 5.6% inflation. And by the way, the recession actually started in November, December-ish of 2007, but inflation carried on going up. And then we had this massive collapse in prices where house prices dropped 25, 30, 40, 50% in some areas, which had a huge impact on inflation. And that is the primary reason why we saw deflation. Now, I want everyone to be aware that deflation is significantly worse than inflation. What causes deflation is essentially consumer spending comes to a halt, and corporations are forced to slash prices in order to try bring back a little more demand for their products. When you have inflation, it still means the consumer is pretty strong. They're out shopping, they're buying homes, they're getting into cars, they're buying things for their family, they're going on holidays. When you have deflation, a lot of that is basically non-existent, and that is what causes prices to drop drastically. So when people say they want prices to go back to 2020, to go back to 2021, they want the cost of everyday items to drop substantially, what you're really asking for is a significant recession. that is the only way that you experience deflation, and where the cost of goods can go back 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years. And that is really what happened during the housing crisis. Home prices gave up 2 to 3 years of gains. In some cases, they gave up 4 or 5 years. So when people are saying, I want prices to go back the way they were, rent is out of control, I can't afford the average home, that may be true, but you really want a huge recession. And be aware that if a large recession happens, you get the unemployment rate spiking. You get the unemployment rate going to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And in most cases, those are everyday employees who are on a salary. This is not the top 1%, the top 10%. Who can really benefit from a recession. The average employee will not benefit from a recession because most of them have lost their job. So in my opinion, we need to maintain some sort of inflation. Now the Fed's target right now, before they start cutting rates, supposedly is around 2%. Personally, I think they might cut rates before that. I think they're just waiting for the unemployment rate to increase a little bit more. So if we get to 2%, the Fed starts cutting rates, maybe stimulate the economy a little bit more, because consumer spending is pretty flat right now. As it stands, the top 10% is making up for 50% of all spending in the economy. So as long as we can get down to 2% inflation, now obviously tariffs are going to be a factor that is unforeseen. We don't really know how it's going to impact inflation, if it's just going to be 1 or 2 months where the cost of goods spike temporarily, and then the rate of change at which those goods increase in value can actually trend down. A lot of that, we'll have to wait and see how everything plays out. But the dangerous part of inflation dropping this fast, and it really has dropped pretty fast. If you look back here, when it went to 9.1%, it dropped very quickly down to 3%. And of course, the Fed was doing the fastest rate hiking cycle in history, so it's not really a surprise. But if this goes to a deflationary period, there is a very good chance that we are either in a recession or about to enter a very large recession. And if you look back to the 2008 financial crisis, inflation dropped very, very quickly, but that went to deflation even quicker. And we were already at the heart of most of the recession while this deflationary period was happening. And if we enter a recession, you're going to see more layoffs, even more than we've already seen for the last year. Basically, all you've seen is private sector laying off people, specifically in the tech sector where most of the layoffs have been, which is a lot of high income individuals. Now, government jobs, they've also been declining substantially over the last few months. So we'll have to wait and see how everything plays out. But this is just a video on inflation versus deflation. And when people say, I want prices to go back to where they used to be, believe me, you absolutely do not. Deflation would mean a substantial recession. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.